everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of The Introduction. I have a very lovely guest. Her name is Kait Ahern. She currently works with Generation Ratify as well as Progressive Projects. So without further ado, I will let her speak.
Hi, my name's Kait Ahern. I am a 20-year-old student and political activist from Scranton, Pennsylvania. I currently go to school at Lafayette College, and I'm also studying to get certified in cybersecurity at MIT.
Oh, okay. What made you want to go to cybersecurity?
So it's actually all tied back into politics. I really do think the future of, unfortunately, warfare and terrorism is going to be across the internet. I think we're going to kind of take a path away from conventional on-the-ground warfare, and it's going to be hacking and cyber threats. So I wanted to better understand that. So when I do get involved with politics, I'll be able to help out in that sphere as well.
So we immediately went right into it. Okay, so if let's brainstorm away real quick. Terrorism this, terrorism that. If we're gonna break away from what is on the ground warfare, what do you think? Cyber or nuclear?
So
What do you think is gonna be worse for us?
So I mean, they're both terrible, obviously, but we're right now seeing more cyber threats. We've obviously had hacking that was proven in several elections from other states. We've had things like data breaches in the FBI, in the federal government. These are huge, huge problems, and our government isn't equipped to deal with them. Now, I really can't be complaining about the work that the Senate's trying to do with cybersecurity, but the people that they have leading these efforts are 70 and 80-year-old senators who really don't understand cybersecurity. And it's to no fault of their own, but it's a huge problem, and the government really needs to step up their game if they want to protect us from cyber threats.
You're saying we need a new influx of youth in there?
Definitely. We definitely should be outsourcing to try to find people who know what they're talking about with this, because it's really complicated. And there's no shame in trying to get some extra help from people who do know what's going on.
Okay, so real quick then. With that said, should there be like an examination, for those older people, like a driver's license? We all say, once you hit 70 years old and you can't see anymore, you shouldn't be driving. Is this the same thing?
So I definitely think if you're going to be on a data team in the Senate, if you're going to be working with computer science, you should be certified in computer science. There should definitely be some sort of test to make sure you know what you're talking about. If you're specifically writing legislation about computer science, technology, we wouldn't expect someone to teach physics in college if they studied art. So we really can't be expecting these senators, most of them have backgrounds in law and history, to be able to do things like coding and cybersecurity without being trained.
Some people wouldn't even really think about that though. They would say, look, we're strictly doing law, we're strictly doing government in college. This is what we go to school for. You wouldn't really think, hey, look, our senators should know cybersecurity. They should know all these other things. So yeah. It's weird it's not necessarily weird, but it's insightful to hear you say that hey, look, we do need cybersecurity. We need more people who are hands-on with this stuff. Now, you said that cybersecurity ties into politics for you.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I really think that our generation needs to make politics more intersectional. So we've obviously seen politics become intersectional with things like social issues, with things like race and gender and religion. And that's so fantastic. But we also need to become intersectional with things like technology and STEM, because we've kind of overlooked those in politics. We have focused more on social issues. We have focused more on economics. And the world's changing. And politics, not just American politics, politics in general, needs to really start reflecting that.
So you're saying that politics has to more or less shine a light on, the electronics, on the cyber side of things, and not just really based on, okay, we have, not to, take away from what's going on today, we have COVID, we have racial issues, all those other things. We should really be focusing or putting a little more attention on cybersecurity?
Absolutely. So obviously the things that you just mentioned are the most pervasive issues facing America right now. But we should be shining some more light, as you said, on things like technology and STEM.
Okay.
And especially as we're moving forward, we've really put kind of no energy and no effort into understanding even things like Google. So there's a very famous Senate hearing that happened, and the chairs of Google and at another point Amazon sat down and were talking to them about technology, and the senators had no idea how even Google worked. So clearly this is, I mean, it's something we're laughing about here because I mean we know how to work Google.
Yeah,
We know,
it's our
you know,
basic stuff. It's
it's
really
all,
like easy.
yeah, it's basic standard things that we grew up with. But for a lot of the senators, they actually grew up before computers even existed.
Okay.
So this is something we don't really think about. But for example, one of the senators who was doing a lot of work with the internet, Senator Blumenthal, he grew up and went through college and high school before not only the internet existed, but before computers existed.
Okay.
So yeah, this is kind of why it's something that politics needs to evolve to face this changing world we're in.
But how do we evolve politics though? How do we really how do we shine light on that?
That's a great question. So, I mean, I won't lie and say I have the answer for us here.
You can
If
give us
I
something
did,
that's close as possible. We'll take it. We'll take it.
I mean, for me, I think a great first step would just be trying to increase the diversity of people that we have in Congress to make it more intersectional.
Okay.
Congress still very much on a social level it's primarily white, it's primarily male, and on an educational level, it's primarily people who studied law and history. And we do have some business people in there as well.
Okay.
We don't really have STEM people. We don't really have people that represent the type of Americans that live in America. We don't really have people of color. We don't really have that many women. And we especially don't have people that identify beyond the gender binary. So Congress doesn't reflect America.
Okay.
Not only on this kind of educational professional scale where everyone's a lawyer pretty much, but also it just doesn't reflect the type of people who call America home.
So what you just said you hit on it. You hit on a lot of different things just now. But like you said, we're not diversified in Congress. We're mainly, white, male, who are law and history majors. Do you think if we had that, let's say, cyber background, let's say financial background, let's say, even agricultural, do you think that would, push Congress in the right direction per se? Let's say 10, 20 years down the line, we're looking at what, 2040? 2040 will be a whole new time for us. We won't even know really what's going on. Like the Senate's now, we'll be more or less in a stone age.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
So do you think within that time, or do you think at that time period, we're going to be sitting here thinking, damn, we were just having this conversation yesterday about, hey, we need to diversify Congress. Do you think that's something where it'll be, answered or put into place?
I honestly don't think it's going to be completely answered. So, I mean, here's what we have to think about, right?
Okay.
The United States has been around this government for a few hundred years now. And on top of that, there's always been women in America. There's always been people of color in America. It's not something that's new and revolutionary. People like that have always been here, and they've always been Americans. But Congress in these few hundred years has done relatively nothing to make it a more inclusive space and a more reflective space.
Okay.
So I would really, really like for in the next 40 years, Congress to finally take that kick in the butt and start kind of becoming a more diversified, inclusive space. But I'm not confident it will, because it's been a long time coming, right? And we're getting in the right direction. But that's what people said in the 1920s. That's what people said in the 1960s, right? Yep. So there's been a lot of times in history where people have kind of been like, okay, this is the moment. This is finally our moment. Politics is going to change. And I think we need to focus less on asking, hey, when do we think it's going to change? And focus more on, putting that groundwork in and making sure that we can make it happen as soon as we can.
Okay. Okay. So I get that. and I understand that, but so let's move away from this topic because we're gonna come back to this. I'm gonna have more questions. So let me ask you something then, right? So, just going back to speaking about Congress, we're gonna move away from this topic and we're gonna come back to I'm gonna have more questions because this is something great. This is something that we could talk about for days. But what I do want to know from you is if you had to rank your presidents through our lifetime, we've had the Bush administration, Obama, Trump, and now we're going through the Biden administration, which is in its early stages. Who would you rank? Like, what would your order be?
So that's a great question. How would I answer this? Well, I know who my last would be. And I feel like many people who are involved with politics across the board, no matter what party you belong to, would agree with this. Trump is my least favorite. I think he was, I quite frankly, I mean, I think he was a horrendous president. He reminds me of Andrew Jackson, who historically, we all kind of know that he was not the best president. He wasn't very democratic. And so
real quick to stop you there. Hold on, real quick. Wouldn't you say that Trump had, a couple good things to him?
I mean, yes, but ideologically, I think he was a very weak president. I think that he had a tendency to shift kind of whatever policies he once believed in just to get votes. And we saw that. For example, he used to support abortion rights, and then he obviously during his presidency did not support them. He also did many other things that crossed the line between being a good democratic president in a democracy versus being kind of more authoritarian and just kind of, I know a lot of people across the political spectrum who really like politics and respect democracy just did not like the way he handled things. And obviously, ideologically, as I just said, I just did not agree with most of the things he stood for, represented.
Yeah. That's understandable. Like some people, they have a certain type of feeling. They feel what he's saying, you just don't agree with. And like you said before, his policies shifted. He didn't seem to stay true with what he was doing or what he was saying before. But I have another president who I could say is also, you could say he's doing the same thing right now. But even though it's still early, it's almost like he is doing the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, continue. My bad for interrupting.
Oh, that's all right. So we could talk about Biden next, definitely. So he actually is a very interesting person in politics. So obviously he's been in politics a long time. He's done some very bad things in politics when he first got started out. He did sign on to quite a few kind of racially charged bills. Now we looked back and we're like, okay, that's like very clearly those were racist. We know that today in 2021. Back then they didn't, there was no one really talking about that in politics at the time. So we could look back and see what his past actions have been. And he doesn't have a clean record. There isn't really a clean slate that he's working with. That being said, I'm pleasantly surprised with how he has handled a lot of things. There are also a handful of things where I'm not very pleasantly surprised with, namely kind of international affairs. I'm a little disappointed on how we're handling that, especially when it comes to giving out COVID relief to our allies. Yeah, so that's kind of just my original first impressions and thoughts that I have about Biden as a president.
Okay. So comparing the two, we already know that you don't like Trump. So far though, comparing their 100 days, who would you give it to, Trump or Biden?
So I would definitely give it to Biden. And the reason why it's a no-brainer. Let's take my kind of political affiliation out of the question. Reason why is because Biden's dealing with a huge national crisis right now. And he was not only kind of handed this crisis when he started his administration, but he was handed the mess of the crisis that was left over from the inactions of the last administration.
So real quick, not to stop you there, but are we including, what happened over the summer with George Floyd, COVID starting? Are we including all of that? Or are we just speaking on, what happened with COVID?
So for now, I'm just talking about COVID, but I am
Okay.
going to talk about George Floyd and all of that in a few minutes. Sorry about that.
Okay. No, you're good. You're good.
I did not make that clear, but the crisis I'm talking about, first of all, would be the COVID crisis. So we've obviously seen the mess that was left over from the Trump administration. There was a lot of inaction, and he wasn't effective in mobilizing the states and getting the states to agree. In fact, he politicized something that should have been purely scientific, which, I mean, if we look at the World Health Organizations that have been talking about this, that was one of the most detrimental pitfalls that the American government had, was that there was someone in charge who was supposed to be the person who would protect all Americans, and he chose to politicize it, and he chose to polarize it. And so it was disastrous, the response we had. We were not getting vaccines out enough, like through trials, through clinical trials fast enough. Despite what Trump was saying on the news, if we look at the data, he was doing very little to actually move this along. He was doing very little with mask mandates. And when you don't do things like that, that's what leads to shutdowns. So if we did have people that were following rules correctly, if we did have people that were working towards creating these vaccinations, the economy might not have been hit so hard.
Okay.
So I really think the way that the Biden administration has handled and tried to turn this around has been miraculous over the past 100 days. I wasn't expecting it to be so successful, so efficient, so effective, because the infrastructure that was left by the last administration was just absolutely broken.
Okay. So, yeah, I wouldn't have thought about it that way. I more or less would have thought about it, okay, Biden's come in and, everyone is still in upheaval.
Mhm.
Everyone is now like, we're getting vaccines out across the US. They're pushing it out, but Biden's still saying, hey, look, you need to wear your mask. Now you have, I think it was 13 to 15 states that said, look, we're done with wearing our masks.
Mhm.
And they haven't gotten anything. Some of those states, their numbers actually dropped significantly. So just looking at that, Biden saying, hey, look, you need to keep wearing your mask. Trump was used to be saying, you could take your mask off. You're good. I'm kind of over here like, well, who should I believe? What should go on? Like really, who was more or less telling me the truth?
So something that's really good to think about when it comes to this is, so a lot of urban areas, right? We had high concentrations, high volumes of people. And so that's how things spread.
Yeah.
In these more like rural areas where people are more spaced out, we might not have to worry about community spread as much because you're not constantly running into 70, 80 people in a day. Now, I live near a medium-sized city, and just going to get my coffee in the morning, I'll run into 30, 35 people, just going to do something like that, right? If you live in New York, you're going to run in, if you live in New York City, somewhere like that, or Philly.
Yeah, you're bumping into someone at least once a minute.
Exactly. You're bumping into hundreds of people. And that's how community kind of the spread happens. Yeah, sure. We think about, I'll catch it from a friend, I'll catch it from a family member, but it's so much easier to spread something through a community when the community is so much more densely packed. And so a lot of these states where we don't have mask mandates, right? For the most part, they don't have cities. And if they do have cities like South Carolina, for example, it's Charleston. And it's a city that, again, it's like a kind of medium-sized city. You're not going to be bumping into hundreds of people on your way to get a coffee in the morning. So it's really interesting. Like you said, it's definitely something that I have thought about a lot because you're right. It's a very kind of puzzling issue.
Yeah. It makes you wonder. It makes you think. It's like, well, what is right? What is wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So moving up that list though, you have Bush and Obama.
Okay. So I'll be honest. I have a soft spot for President Obama. I met him when I was 8. And
wait, hold on. We got to stop. You got to tell us about that.
Absolutely. So my parents volunteered on his campaign before he was even the primary candidate. So he was just, just getting started out. My parents saw him speak at the DNC, I believe, and they really, really liked his passion and his vision for America.
Okay.
Now, I already told you this, but I grew up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. I lived 5 miles away from one of the largest landfills in the country. So that was really difficult growing up because we didn't have any local politicians who stood up for us.
Okay.
In fact, I remember being 7 and 8 years old and understanding that the politicians didn't care about us. They cared about money. They cared about kind of paying off these corporations that were helping out with the landfill. They didn't care that they were ruining the environment, that they were letting down the people of my community. And as a child, that's really heavy stuff to kind of come to terms with. So my parents volunteered on his campaign, and I got the chance to meet him and speak with him. And I immediately knew what question I wanted to ask him. I really wanted to know, first and foremost, what someone like me could do to help my own community, because I was really disillusioned with politicians at this point. And I'll never forget this. He knelt down, got face to face with me, and he told me that the greatest thing about America is that anyone can make a difference in it. So that really stuck with me, and it's definitely shaped the person I want to be. And I think that really left a very lasting impression on me.
Would you say that Obama was your role model at the time? Like after he told you that, after he said that to you, because yeah, you're doing politics now, you're heavily in politics, and this is shaping,
Absolutely.
cybersecurity, this is shaping, you want to be a politician. So with him speaking to you that day, or you at least getting the chance to see him, was that something that really pushed you?
Absolutely it did. I really had a bad taste in my mouth with politicians before I met him.
Okay.
I was obviously a child, so I didn't fully understand what they did, but I did know that they let people down. I knew that they didn't care about me and my community and that they were in it for the wrong reasons.
Okay.
So to have not only an adult, but someone like then Senator Obama kind of speak to me that as if I mattered, as if I was a child, but I could be spoken to as if I mattered, as if I had a voice, I could make a difference. That definitely made him my biggest role model at the time. I'd never had an adult speak to me that way before.
Yeah, it made you, it was almost like he spoke to you one-on-one, more or less, and not as a child.
Exactly.
He spoke to you as an adult. Mm-hmm. And most of the time as a child, we're spoken to like, hey, look, they're not going to understand anything. They're just going to take it and they're going to keep moving on. But he was able to at least say, look, this is what has to be done. This is what has to happen.
Exactly.
And he gave it to you in a mature way, which is, amazing to hear. I had, 2 more questions for you. One thing was, where do you see yourself in 5 years?
That's a great question. So I wish I knew the answer to it, but I could say right now that I'd like to get involved with journalism.
Okay.
And immediately after college, I think that's where I'll go. I really love telling the truth to people, and I like making sure that the full truth gets out to people. And I think that that's something that is somewhat neglected in today's journalism. Now, I love reading the news. I do it more than anything else in the day, but people do really infuse their own opinions into where we should just be telling, this black and white news. And I understand nothing's black and white, but I think a lot of readers today will read that opinion as if it's a fact. And that really disillusions people. It really adds to the polarization we have. So, I mean, earlier today, you mentioned, hey, like there had to be some things that Trump did that you liked. And I think that was kind of a great question, because when we read the news, for example, if you had an author with a journalist with political opinions like mine, they would never admit if there even was something good that he did. And that's kind of how the state of the media is right now. And it's very saddening for me, because I'd like the raw truth to be able to get out to people, because it's not going to hurt anyone. If people know the truth, it can only help people understand what's going on in the country the best way they can, unapologetically, kind of unfiltered. And I think that that's the direction that journalism needs to get back to.
Okay. So if you were to do journalism, right? If you were to do journalism, what type of journalism though? Would it be broadcast? Would you want to be front and center? Let's actually, yeah, riots over the summer, the George Floyd riots. Vice was there. Hands down, they were there trying to get first accounts. Is that something that you would be comfortable doing?
Absolutely. I really love focusing on the everyday American. I think that that's something that I would really want to focus on in my journalism.
Is that something you want to shed light on?
Oh, can you repeat that?
Is that something you want to shed light on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Americans, everyday Americans, we are the lifeblood of democracy. And yeah, of course, we have to pay attention to Congress. And I do love writing pieces and reporting about what's going on in national politics. But I also would love to report and talk to and kind of get down on the ground with activists, with community organizers, because they are the backbone of democracy. We don't get social change without community organizers. We don't get movements. We don't get progress unless we have these organizers, these everyday Americans who are really fueling the movements. At the end of the day, it's not just 100 senators who are making the change. It's not just one president. It's millions of Americans who are making this change with them and backing them up. And I think that that's too often forgotten when we talk about democracy and media and journalism.
So, okay, because I like this conversation. We have the First Amendment rights where we have the ability to speak freely. That is taken away from us so often without anyone ever realizing it though, and it's almost like, hey, look, if we have the opportunity to speak freely, why can't we?
Exactly. So I actually did some work over the summer with, over the summer, I do run social media kind of pages where I try to, as best I can, educate people on what's really going on. I give them resources when I can, just to help out community organizers. And I did create this kind of guide about your First Amendment rights for protesters with the George Floyd protests. And I was watching news clips, and there were people that were getting their rights absolutely trampled on. They were getting arrested. They were being violated with their search and seizure rights under the Fourth Amendment. There was just a slew of illegal things that the cops were doing to protesters. And so I created this pamphlet, and it basically was like, hey, these are your rights. If someone violates it, you tell them, and they should be the ones that would get arrested. So that's definitely something.
Did you hand out that pamphlet? Did you hand out that pamphlet?
So I actually posted it on social media, and I encouraged people to share it that way. So it did get around. It had a few hundred shares, which I was really happy about, because like, this is something that's very, very important to social movements, is making sure people's First Amendment rights are protected and that they're safe as they can be, and they're able to, air their grievances like the Constitution says they should be.
So with that all said, right? Because with people taking away rights, there are two different sides to protest. There's some sides where people are like, hey, we're here peacefully to peacefully protest. And then, there's riots. Now, real quick, this is one of those funny things. The storming on the Capitol over this, I think it was Christmas break for us, because both college students. The storming of the Capitol, would you say that was more of a riot or a peaceful protest?
So that was okay. So I'm a big First Amendment junkie here. So I could kind of definitively outline that it was not a peaceful protest. So first of all, okay, let's pretend they didn't have weapons, which they did. So let's pretend they didn't, right? It was just a bunch of people storming the Capitol, and they were really trying to do it peacefully. The First Amendment still would not protect them. You're unable to protest on government property when it kind of interferes with government activity, if it obstructs any sort of government officials. So obviously, they stormed the Capitol, broke windows right in the middle of a joint session of Congress. On top of that, they were counting the number of electoral votes for who was going to be president. So that was the biggest obstruction of kind of government duties that they barged in on. So even if they didn't have weapons, if they weren't armed, if they just wanted to sit around in a big circle and protest quietly, they still would not be protected by the First Amendment because of that.
Okay. So, before we wrap things up, I have one final question for you. Tell me about the groups you're in.
Sure.
You have two groups you're in and everything. And how is that, what is that going to lead you to next?
Sure. So right now I'm currently doing work with Generation Ratify. It's this amazing youth-led movement to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment in Congress, and we focus on other gender equity bills as well.
Okay.
We do a lot of work with intersectionalism, so we want to make sure that, everything's equal for everyone in America. And
throwing it back to how you were mentioning Congress and intersectional.
Exactly. Okay. So the ERA, for those who aren't familiar with it, it's been trying to be passed now since the 70s. Since it was first kind of brought up to Congress, it's been a long time coming. And we're still trying to get that passed. It's been shot down a lot of times, but we are confident that we're finally going to make sure that women are represented and people beyond the gender binary by the Constitution.
For those that don't know what ERA is, can you explain that?
Absolutely. So the Equal Rights Amendment would basically be an amendment that would outlaw discrimination on the basis of sex. So that would protect pretty much everyone who does not identify as a man. There's nowhere in the Constitution where women are mentioned as being given directly constitutional rights. Only men are explicitly mentioned. Okay. So it's not just a symbolic thing. It would also affect things like the pay gap. It would affect things like making sure menstrual products are available in schools and colleges, things like that. Just making America a more equitable place for everyone.
We're in 2020 and that's not, we're in the new decade and that's still not a thing. It blows my mind. It's honestly like, just hearing you say that, it's crazy to believe. And it's also like me speaking to other people and just saying, hey, look, the pay gap is really a big difference. And I see it heavily in sports. Mm-hmm. And so many people be like, yeah, they play more, they do more, they do this, they do that. But honestly, they play damn well near the same amount of seasons or the same amount of games, and there's for basketball is at least $300,000, $400,000 difference in pay. So that's just something, something that most people wouldn't even realize.
Yeah, the only time women are mentioned in the Constitution is in the amendment where women were given the right to vote. And that's it. So in the original Constitution, there's nothing, and we're only mentioned in the one amendment that said, hey, by the way, women are allowed to vote. So that's kind of why it's so important to activists right now, because like you just said, it's been a long time coming, and there's a lot of people, there's a lot of good Americans who would really like to feel represented by the Constitution.
Okay. And your next one, it was progressive. Yeah,
so it's called the Progressive Turnout Project. It is a group that I had the opportunity to organize with during the last election season. Okay. So I worked for a congressman's office as a fellow through the Progressive Turnout Project. And through a connection I made in the Progressive Turnout Project, I then had the opportunity to work as a research fellow for Jon Ossoff's campaign.
Who is Jon Ossoff?
So Jon Ossoff is one of the two new senators from Georgia. So he was just elected in that special election along with Senator Warnock. So it was definitely an amazing opportunity, and they've really inspired me to continue my work with campaigns and community grassroots organizing.
Okay. So with that, said, you built a connection. Mm-hmm. You built a connection with the senators. You've been able to meet all these people as well.
So I was not able to meet Senator Ossoff because I was remote, but yes, most of the people that I've worked with, I've had the pleasure of speaking with and meeting and working with directly.
Okay. So real quick, this is my final question, both of us being college students. How important is your degree to you?
So that's a great question. So
is it just a piece of paper or is it something more?
So here's kind of my thoughts on this. So I am at school on a scholarship right now. I wouldn't be able to afford the 2 degrees I'm getting without it.
Okay.
And if you're in a position, if anyone's listening who's in a position where they can't afford a degree, it's not the end of the world, right? You will be able to make change. You will be able to kind of follow your dreams, even if you can't pursue that degree. We do have a society that really puts a lot of weight on getting degrees. But if that's not something you can financially, emotionally, mentally kind of handle right now, it's not the end of the world. With things like the internet, with things like social media, you can make these amazing connections on your own. I've been lucky enough to be able to do a lot of work in organizing, and I don't have a college degree yet. So, just speaking from firsthand experience, you can make change happen without having that kind of piece of paper, like you just said.
Okay. All righty. Well, that's good to know. Working towards getting my degree, but for everyone else that can't or does not have the ability to go to college, this is something where you guys can take it and go and run with it. Honestly, like Kate said when she was 8 years old when you met Obama, right? Basically, everyone can go out and make a change. It's not like you have to have your degree. You can go out and do something. So thank you for being on the show today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. I loved having this conversation. I think
No
it was
problem.
great and organic, and it's definitely going to be awesome to listen back to.
No problem. No problem. We're definitely looking forward to seeing what you do in the coming years. But thank you again. And everyone, thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of The Introduction.
Bye. Thank you.
See ya.